BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode I will be examining the Jack the Ripper suspect Harry Dam. This is going to be a different type of episode because, as we're going to see, there are multiple mysteries that are within the Jack the Ripper mystery. But of course, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888, and whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Box Ned. Again, this is going to be a very different episode because there are multiple stories that we can talk about, and I used to do the segment, the Jack the Ripper Report, where I combine different Jack the Ripper stories within a single episode, and I'm going to do some of that at the end, but I really want to emphasize something, and that is that Jack the Ripper was not only a serial killer, there also have been a set of letters that have been written that have been attributed to the murderer, and Harry Dam is mostly a suspect in what is called the Ripper hoax theory, the idea that Jack the Ripper was not the person who committed the murders, or you could even say it in vice versa, that there was a real serial killer in Whitechapel, the Whitechapel murderer, and that a different person wrote the letters. And Harry Dam, from my own readings, apparently is mostly a suspect for writing the letters, and I have to give full credit to the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel and website. They have been all over the story, and they've been putting out some amazing content. Richard Jones, who runs Jack the Ripper Tour, has been hitting it out of the park lately with a lot of his videos, as well as providing free resources for people to examine. So let's look at who Harry Dam was, because for starters, he was an American. He was an American who was in England at the time, and when you read Jack the Ripper's letters, most of them have been dismissed as hoaxes or not actually coming from the killer, but there are three letters that are given very strong consideration: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. And on a recent episode of Ripper Wednesday, I was talking about how I think that either the author of the Dear Boss letter was a native English speaker, like say perhaps from England or America, right? Or that this person learned English at a very young age. This was someone who grew up and was educated in the English language. And the same is true of the Saucy Jackie postcard. Then when you get to the From Hell letter, which was mailed in mid-October of 1888, that is one that is filled with more intense misspellings, as well as just some bizarre grammar, and it has a completely different writing style. So let's talk about this. And furthermore, who was Harry Dam? Let's look at an article from Jack the Ripper Tour. One suspect whose name has been put forward as the author of the letter that was mailed, known as the Dear Boss letter, had an association with a newspaper called The Star. On the 4th of October, the Daily Telegraph published facsimiles of what is known as the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. And they commented by saying, the writer is probably an American or an Englishman who has mixed with our cousins on the other side of the Atlantic. This person uses words like boss, fix me, shan't quit, and right away, and they are American forms of expressions. I just want to point out that every Monday I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer here on Black Box Online Radio, and I invite you to listen to that. You can also get the show anywhere you get your podcasts, any of those major sites. You can download it for free. And in the Zodiac Killer mystery, the Zodiac liked to use the word shall, S-H-A-L-L, and that makes people think that he was British. And in the Jack the Ripper case, Jack the Ripper's using the word shan't, and now people think that Jack the Ripper was an American. It's just really interesting how people make these observations. And we're going to look at Harry Dam as a suspect for being a member of the Ripper hoax theory, or a participant in the Ripper hoax theory. And I say participant because, as you just heard, he's working for the paper The Star, and this could have been something that was created by a journalist to sell newspapers, creating mass hysteria, or presenting the image of terror in Whitechapel. But as previously stated, there could have been a real serial killer. It's just somebody, like let's say perhaps a newspaper reporter or somebody working for the paper, was pretending to be the Ripper, and that's how the Ripper hoax theory gets launched. But his name was Henry Jackson Wells Dam, and his professional name was H.J.W. Dam. He was commonly known as Harry Dam, a journalist with somewhat of a checkered past who was born in San Francisco and also worked for the paper. Harry Dam came to London in 1887 and became a correspondent for several New York papers. When T.P. O'Connor launched the newspaper The Star in 1888, Harry Dam also contributed articles. And this is going to get into the next section, and I'm not going to lie to you guys, this is the whole reason why I wanted to talk about this on Ripper Wednesday. It was reported that Harry Dam was not afraid of libel laws. Lincoln Springfield, who had been the Star's chief reporter at the time of the murders, claimed in his 1924 autobiography that Harry Dam was a free-born American who was not afraid, as the rest of us were, of the English libel laws, and it was Dam, so Springfield claimed, who created a sensation by pushing the idea that the murders were the work of a miscreant known as Leather Apron. And as we're going to see, I mean, you guys know the story, of course, that at first there is a murder that takes place in August of 1888, the murder of Martha Tabram. Then we go to August 31st of 1888 with the murder of Polly Nichols. And early on, there is going to be a suspect that is going to be discussed, and his name is John Pizer, and he has been labeled by history as Leather Apron. And of course, he has mostly been exonerated from being Jack the Ripper. As I understand, John Pizer had an airtight alibi for the early murders, so very simply, he was not exactly ruled out, but for all intents and purposes, he was ruled out. So let's keep reading, though, about Harry Dam, the focus of this episode. In November of 1890, the Reverend Henry A. Moore published a series of articles about a trip to Europe, and he shared some info about Harry Dam. And let's keep reading about Harry Dam. The letters were fake. Few people in London believed in the genuineness of the Jack the Ripper letters. They were simply the invention of some sensational fool or a fake set of letters from a newspaper. In fact, there is a strong suspicion that a New York World reporter might have been exercising his peculiar home talent just to try its effect upon the British cousins. Well, now this is something that is going to be widely disputed by people. Not everyone says that, because apparently the police took very strong consideration of this. And I remember when I interviewed Richard Patterson, who's the author of the book Jack the Ripper, the Works of Francis Thompson, he stated very clearly that he believed that the letters were authentic, the Dear Boss letter, Saucy Jackie postcard, From Hell letter, because they were given strong consideration as being authentic by the members of law enforcement at the time, and it's my understanding that they investigated all of the hoax letters. There were over 1,000 letters that were mailed at the time, and reportedly, again, this is just me backtracking from the 21st century, but reportedly, all of these leads were followed up, and only a handful of letters are given strong consideration. And I would say outside of the Dear Boss letter, Saucy Jackie postcard, and From Hell letter, the Openshaw letter is given strong consideration, and then maybe after that the McCarthy letter. But few people in London believed that the letters were genuine. I don't even think that's a fair representation. And to be clear, that's not from Richard Jones. That is a quotation from somebody who was somewhat connected to the scene at the time. Harry Dam the Ripper. This is the first hint of Harry Dam being behind the original Jack the Ripper correspondence, although it should be noted that Monroe didn't actually name the reporter in question. However, a little under a month later, Harry Dam was linked directly to the authorship of the letter by an article that appeared in the San Francisco Examiner. The San Francisco Examiner, what a wonderful publication. That one comes up all the time as well on Zodiac Monday, because the Zodiac operated in the San Francisco Bay Area. Commenting on the story in its edition of the Thursday the 4th December of the Carson City Morning Appeal, they couldn't resist punning. The Examiner claims that Harry Dam, an old newspaper man, is the author of the Jack the Ripper letters. They always had the appearance of being a damn fake to the Appeal. Yes, a play on words there, a damn fake to the Appeal. And this is something that goes to show that he seems like he is somebody who is in England at the time. He is someone who is working in the newspaper business, and the Star is the newspaper that gets accused of trying to do this because they're trying to get their sales up. I've heard contradictory stories about the Star. One of them is that they did this to save the newspaper, but as I understand, the Star was actually expanding its circulation, so their paper might have actually been doing fairly well. And I just want to point out that there are multiple suspects for fabricating the letters as part of a Ripper hoax theory. And the other two widely discussed ones are Thomas Bowling, who worked for the Central News Agency, and Frederick Best, who was another member of the Star. But right now, though, I mean, what do you think so far? Like, can you weigh in on this? Like, what is your response? Do you think that this story is starting to make sense to you, that the letters could have been written by an American who was pretending to be some type of English mad serial killer? And let's look here, though, at some of the final concluding points. There is no evidence yet. The fact is, unless some private correspondence comes to light that reveals without a shadow of a doubt, and these are the words of Richard Jones, by the way, the fact is that unless some private correspondence comes to light that reveals without a shadow of a doubt that one of them was behind the Dear Boss hoax, then we are destined to remain in the dark about who it actually was and who wrote the Jack the Ripper letters. What is certain, though, is that whoever the originator of the name was, he could not have realized as he scrawled his signature that he was about to create a legend that would turn into a sordid set of East End murders into an international phenomenon, and from that point on, the line between the unknown miscreant who was responsible for the Whitechapel atrocities and the fictional creation of Jack the Ripper would become so blurred as to be non-existent. And I do think that the general public does believe that Jack the Ripper wrote the letters. I remember the first conversation I ever had about Jack the Ripper, and someone stated that they thought that, Jack the Ripper wrote the letters, and that's why they were fascinated about this case, because of the letters, even more so than the murders. And to you, those of you who follow Ripper Wednesday, I think that you guys know where I stand on something like this. For the longest time, I was a defender of the Ripper hoax theory. I was just like gung-ho for it. I was like, this is what I'm going with, that the letters were fabricated by a journalist. I really thought Frederick Best was the only reasonable suspect for writing the letters. But when you look at the activities of the Ripper, if you're just going to say that there's some type of unconnected serial killer apart from the letters, then why is there such a small window of time from the murder of Polly Nichols to the double event? Like, say, for example, Polly Nichols is murdered on August 31st of 1888. Annie Chapman is murdered on September 8th of 1888. And then the Dear Boss letter is written on September 25th of 1888, and also threatening more murders. Then the Dear Boss letter is mailed and received on September 27th of 1888. Then 3 days later, after this threat has been made, the killer acts again. The killer hasn't operated in 3 weeks, and then 3 days after the receiving of the Dear Boss letter, the killer attacks 2 women in one night, Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. So when I said I had a reversal, I went from just thinking that, yeah, the Ripper hoax theory is the only possible option to like, now, wait a second. This is some very odd timing. And the only way that I could reconcile this with the Ripper hoax theory is that maybe people who are working for the newspapers, let's say for the Star, let's just do this as a hypothetical, actually. Hypothetically, if Harry Dam actually did write the letters, an American pretending to be an English mad serial killer, well, then you'd have to say that the journalist is closely following the police investigations, talking to members of law enforcement, and they're making the prediction, I repeat, prediction, that the killer's going to act again really soon. And that's exactly what happened. So I have no certainty of that. As I said, that would just be one way that I could try and tie things together by looking at it in retrospect. However, I am completely bothered by that short window of possibility. We're talking about 3 days. That almost makes it seem like there was somebody who was actually behind the Dear Boss letter. But I also want to share with you guys what I really think, and it is that when I read that article from Jack the Ripper Tour for the first time, I came away from it thinking that I bet the average person is going to think that Harry Dam wrote the letters. If you were to just read that, and it's like the second or third Jack the Ripper article that you've ever read, you might come away thinking, yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense. Harry Dam wrote the letters. This American who moved to England in 1887 and is working for a newspaper and doesn't care about getting caught or busted for writing fake stories. All right, he wrote the letters. It makes perfect sense. But as we all know, life doesn't work like that. Life doesn't happen like that. Sometimes people behave in different ways. Sometimes people will do things that are rather unpredictable. And just because you can arrange it in a logical sequence that makes sense to you, it doesn't mean that that's what happened in the true crime world. It doesn't mean that Harry Dam actually fabricated the Dear Boss letter. Never mind that We have an entire other question that the Dear Boss letter was even written by an American. But there is another article that was written about him on amycrocker.com, and this is a website that I've never used before. I always like finding new websites to discuss with you guys here on Black Box Online Radio. And amycrocker.com says, "Pardoning Harry, the man who invented Jack the Ripper, HJW Dam." And it's called Pardoning Harry, so this is going to provide a little bit of counterbalance. And we're going to look at some of the reasons about why they think that Harry Dam may not have been the author of the letters. Between August 31st and November 9th of 1888, 5 brutal, very similar murders took place in Whitechapel, in London. Polly Nichols was murdered on August 31st, Annie Chapman on September 8th, Catherine Eddowes and Liz Stride were murdered on September 30th, although that's in the opposite order. Elizabeth Stride was murdered first, and Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th. The similarities among these murders are all victims that were prostitutes whose throats were cut and provided a field day for the press. Newspapers played a vital role in creating the myth around Jack the Ripper and amplified his terror. There was more potential than normal for speculation and sensationalism in the case of the Whitechapel murders, as there was no witness, the police could uncover no clues or motives, and no serious suspects were found. In those pre-forensic science days, the police could do little more than flood Whitechapel with bobbies, take witness statements, and gather evidence for the coroner. Scotland Yard successfully tested a pair of bloodhounds, but never used them in investigations. And I know this is a little bit off topic and sidetrack, but let's be clear. There were suspects, and we're going to hear all about that later on. And also, there were witnesses who possibly saw Jack the Ripper. I don't think the witnesses saw enough to provide strong details about Jack the Ripper, but it's possible that there were witness sightings of Jack the Ripper. And you guys who follow Ripper Wednesday, we're all very familiar with that. Let's hear about Harry Dam. Harry Dam had, like all British journalists, had been put on the job of solving the Whitechapel murders. But Dam was not British. He was a free-born American, and he was not afraid of the English libel laws. It was a young Harry Dam who created sensation by introducing the first theory of the authorship of these grisly crimes to the terrified public. It was announced that a washed leather apron had been found in the backyard, close to where Annie Chapman had been murdered. I think that that's most likely true because, as I understand, the man who actually owned the leather apron that was used by John Pizer was living very nearby. On September 8th of 1888, the paper reported that Sergeant Thick had arrested John Pizer, a tanner and slipper maker who wore a leather apron for his trade. And the author of the article seemed confident that the police had got their man. This is a quotation. "The man arrested by Detective Sergeant Thick is now at Leman Street Station. He fits the description of leather apron exactly, and this similarity is the cause of his arrest. He denies, however, that he is the man that is wanted, and says that he never wore leather apron in the streets. He is waiting, however, to be recognized or the contrary by some people from Wilmot's lodging house, who know leather apron well. He went along submissively with Detective Sergeant Thick. His stepmother and stepsister deny in the strongest terms that he is the leather apron responsible for any crimes." And once again, that is John Pizer, who was, like I said, for all intents and purposes, exonerated. Harry Dam was accused in the press not of promulgating the leather apron story, but of writing at least one of the notorious Jack the Ripper letters. During the Autumn of Terror, the media, police, and other officials had received a sea of letters. Several of the Ripper letters were written as if they were by the killer himself. The vast majority of them, if not all, were believed to have been hoaxes. 3 letters stood out and were received by the press, and they are the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. It was reported that H.J.W. Dam, that he wrote the Dear Boss letter on September 25th and gave Jack the Ripper his name to boost circulation. And when it says reported, I think it means it's reported that there was an accusation, it's been speculated, he has been accused of this, but absolutely has not been certified or verified. And you guys have heard this all before, but let's read the Dear Boss letter again. "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing that the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and I want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha." The next job I do shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, and the famous lines, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before all the red ink got off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. Okay, so that's the Dear Boss letter, and to anybody out there who thinks that Harry Dam wrote the Dear Boss letter but didn't write any of the others, we're going to have a problem. Maybe you heard in that introductory statement that Harry Dam has been accused of writing at least one of the letters. I just find it very difficult to digest the fact that someone can be accused of writing the Dear Boss letter and not the Saucy Jackie postcard. I'm taking a very, very strong stance on this. I believe the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were written by the same person. And this is one of the biggest reasons why I supported the Ripper hoax theory for so long. And I still would propose that it is a defendable claim. Number one, similar handwriting. Number two, the forensic linguistic analysis that was done by Dr. Andrea Nini that looks at the different combinations of words and the word clusters, about how the syntax is the same, the sentence structures are very similar, even using very, very similar linguistic combinations with small and ordinary words, but the similarities exist all the same. Not to mention the timing. The Dear Boss letter comes right before the double event, the Saucy Jackie postcard comes right after the double event. And if you're going to say that this was not the killer, I will completely hear you out. If you're going to say that this was the killer, I will completely hear you out. And again, I went from being about 90% certain that the letters were an absolute hoax to only about 60% certain that the letters were an absolute hoax because of the timeline involved with the Jack the Ripper case. But I'm still leaning toward this possibility. But the idea that somebody like Harry Dam wrote only the Dear Boss letter, that was the only letter that was written, I am definitely not on board with that. And it also doesn't mean that Jack the Ripper did not write the From Hell letter as well. How difficult would it be for someone to just simply change their handwriting? But we have to look at the facts. This is the way the Dear Boss letter looks, this is the way the Saucy Jackie postcard looks, and Amy Crocker has provided a sample of H.J.W. Dam's handwriting, of Harry Dam's handwriting, and by her admission, it looks absolutely nothing like any of the Jack the Ripper letters, and I agree. Again, just looking at the facts, it's possible to disguise someone's handwriting, but he doesn't appear to write in the same way that Jack the Ripper did. So, as I said, if somebody were to read that article from Jack the Ripper tour, you might be thinking, oh, wow, this guy's an extremely strong suspect for writing the Dear Boss letter, but, and, you know, I mean, no problems with Richard Jones, he's just telling the story, and I mean, but if you were to read that without a lot of other understandings, you might think that Harry Dam was indeed the author of the letters, but not the murderer. Then you do a little bit more reading, and you're going to see, wait a second, maybe he's not the best suspect for being the perpetrator of the Ripper hoax. But I would love to know what you guys think. You can put your ideas in the comment section down below. And as I said before, I used to do a segment here on Black Box Online Radio called the Jack the Ripper Report, where I would talk about multiple Ripper stories within a single episode. And again, I told you at the beginning, Jack the Ripper Tour has been providing a lot of free resources, and they did an interview recently with an individual named Stephen Blomer, who is the author of the book Inside Buck's Row, which talks all about the murder of Marianne Nichols, Polly Nichols, Jack the Ripper's first confirmed victim. And he has a suspect that is a little bit different. And some people would just say his suspect is Aaron Kosminsky, the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. But we're going to hear him introduce his suspect in his own words. Again, this is from his interview on Jack the Ripper Tour, and let's respond.
I actually prefer to use the term Anderson suspect because we don't know who Kosminsky actually was. A lot of us are pretty sure that it must refer to Aaron Kosminsky, but there is an argument it doesn't, and it could refer to an unknown Kosminsky. And why do I find Kosminsky, Aaron Anderson suspect so convincing? Because the two men who ran the case on overall, that's Anderson as the head of CID, and more importantly Swanson, who in my view knew more about the case than anybody else before or since. He coordinated the entire case, all the information came into him, every day. He had daily meetings with the city police as well. While Aberline, who was his equal in rank, was in charge of the investigation on the ground, he left fairly early after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, whereas Swanson carried on coordinating the entire case. Swanson knew more, and it's Swanson who, in the marginalia of Anderson's book, says the suspect was Kosminsky. That's the reason why. Until someone can give me a reason not to accept that, I will go with that. And in probably one of the very last things the late, great Martin Fido wrote, it was an article in a conference booklet in 2018. And I have to paraphrase because I haven't got the thing here, but he says basically, for anyone wanting to put forward a suspect, they have to first dismiss Anderson and Swanson.
And one more time, those were the words of Stephen Blomer, the author of Inside Bucks Row. And what do we make of this? What do we make of this stuff about Aaron Kosminsky? You know, I think that Stephen Blomer and I are actually on a very similar page. Number one, is Kosminsky a reasonable suspect? According to me, yes. According to him, yes. But the reasons are very different. I should point out, though, that one of the reasons why they did this Jack the Ripper Q&A session was they wanted to respond to some of the news that had come out in the past about the shawl, and I'm so tired of talking about this Russell Edwards and the shawl that might have Jack the Ripper's DNA on it. And Stephen Blomer was even saying he thinks that Aaron Kosminsky is a strong suspect, but there's absolutely no certainty about Aaron Kosminsky's DNA even being on the shawl that was presented by Russell Edwards, and this whole media firestorm that happened over the last 2 months is really just a bunch of noise. I mostly agree with that. Richard Jones seemed to agree with that, and almost everyone who looks under the surface in the world of Jack the Ripper, or even if you don't have to go under the surface in the world of Jack the Ripper, watch 5 or 6 YouTube videos about the DNA breakthrough that happened over the last 4 or 5 months, and you're just going to see people questioning the results. They're like, whoa, wait a second, absolutely nothing is certified, absolutely nothing is verified. And that is ultimately where we are going to leave that point. I've talked about this so much on Ripper Wednesday, that's why I didn't want to do another episode exclusively devoted to Kosminsky and the shawl. But the next point that you heard in that video clip there was that one reason why we should think highly of Aaron Kosminsky as a suspect is because he was highly thought of by Sir Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Donald Swanson would be Swanson that he's referring to in the clip. And Swanson, as he calls him, is, by his own admission, by Stephen Blomer's own reporting, that he was the man who knew more about the case than anyone. And from my limited readings about Donald Swanson, that was actually his job. He was actually meant to be the coordinator and central point of communication with the Ripper files, with the investigation, and with all the knowledge. He was meant to be that person who was the go-to on anything Jack the Ripper, like the central figure in terms of Ripper investigations at the time. And both of these men seem to think highly of Aaron Kosminsky as a Jack the Ripper suspect, or to be clear, Kosminsky. And most likely, this is referring to the 23-year-old barber and hairstylist named Aaron Kosminsky that we've all discussed so many times over the last 137 years. But as Stephen Blomer said, this could be referring to a different person. But because these two investigators who knew more about Jack the Ripper than anyone think that Kosminsky was a strong suspect, then that deserves strong consideration. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? My response is, that is evidence. But we have strong evidence, and we have weak evidence. And that is a weak form of evidence. Of course I'm going to listen to someone who knows more about the Jack the Ripper case than anyone, like Swanson and Anderson. Anderson's suspect, as he is referred to in that video clip. But we have to remember that these high-ranking members of law enforcement can get it wrong sometimes. Furthermore, I bring this up all the time in Unsolved Mysteries. Why do we have to listen to people who have not solved the case and just accept everything they say as gospel? I mean, all right, well, they didn't completely identify Kosminsky as the suspect. No disrespect to them. I haven't identified Jack the Ripper either. But again, just stating this as a fact. Number 2, sometimes the authorities get it wrong. Number 3, sometimes there is an overlooked suspect. And I think the clearest example of this is the Golden State Killer case, where Paul Holes, one of the investigators on the Golden State Killer mystery, was simply stating that he thought that there were very good suspects and none of them were the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 as an individual named Joseph D'Angelo. And Paul Holes, the investigator, said he thought there were better suspects than D'Angelo. He was surprised that it was Joseph D'Angelo. However, the physical evidence, in that case DNA, pointed toward Joseph D'Angelo. It just turned out it was somebody else. Just because someone knows more about the case does not mean they're going to find the right suspect. Just because someone has some very good theories and very good hypotheses about the case does not mean that they are going to identify the right suspect. Another example of this, the Long Island serial killer mystery. If you were to go through the suspect profiles about the Long Island serial killer, so many of them made so much sense. When I first looked at the Long Island serial killer mystery, one of the strongest suspects I thought of was an individual named James Bissett. Multiple Long Island serial killer victims were found on the side of Ocean Parkway in rolled burlap, and 2 days after the discovery of one possible victim named Shannon Gilbert, 2 days after that happened, James Bissett committed suicide. He also ran a nursery on Long Island that was the largest supplier of burlap in the area. So it's like, this guy was like, well, there's your Long Island serial killer. But the more that I began to read about the Long Island serial killer case, number one, I didn't believe that Shannon Gilbert was actually a victim of the Long Island serial killer. And number two, it's just so possible that someone could have obtained those materials in a different way. And there's also a suspect named John Bittrolf, who was, number one, a convicted murderer. Number two, killed victims in a similar way. And number three, it's been reported, although I haven't actually verified this, that his daughter was friends with one of the Long Island serial killer victims named Melissa Bartholomew. However, again, it wasn't these guys. It wasn't James Bissett. It wasn't John Bittrolf. The Long Island serial killer has been identified as Rex Heuermann. It was an architect who liked to go to weird sex parties, and sometimes he murdered the women. Absolutely terrible. Absolutely terrible. And I'm not making light of their deaths, but that's what happened. That's what happened. And Rex Heuermann was a terrible person. He kept kill logs and everything. He kept instructions and tips for the next murder. Absolutely sickening. So the whole point is that law enforcement can get it wrong. Some people can compose excellent suspect profiles. They can have some of the strongest reasons about why they think this person was the killer, and he's not the killer. But what do you think about any of my statements about that in response to Steve Blomer's comments on Anderson's suspect, if you will? To be clear, he's stating that his prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case is Anderson's suspect, who is most likely Aaron Kosminsky, but we're not completely convinced that that was indeed Aaron Kosminsky. It could have been another Kosminsky, but I think that it was the 23-year-old barber and hairstylist. And the final thing that I have for you guys is, because Jack the Ripper Tour has been hitting it out of the park, they featured an interview with an individual named Tracy Ianson. She's the author of the book Jacob the Ripper, and it's a book that she actually co-authored with her father. You'll see the names on there, Neil and Tracy Ianson, and their Jack the Ripper suspect is an individual named Jacob Levy. And one thing that she confirmed, which I am a little bit down about, is that there are no surviving photos of Jacob Levy as a Jack the Ripper suspect, or just any of surviving photos of him at all. The graphic that I use of Jacob Levy most often is one that was made for the video game Sherlock Holmes vs. Jack the Ripper. And Jacob Levy was a butcher who lived in Whitechapel, and, I mean, he is, again, another reasonable suspect. Let's be clear, I think Kosminsky is a reasonable suspect. I think Jacob Levy is also a reasonable suspect. Jacob Levy was a butcher who had syphilis. He was in his early 30s at the time. He was 5 feet 3 inches tall, and he was someone who perhaps would have had reasons to target women because of animosity toward women for contracting syphilis, as well as losing control of his mental faculties. Both Jacob Levy and Aaron Kosminsky ended up in the asylums, by the way. And one statement, though, really, really bothered me from Tracy Ianson during her Jack the Ripper Tour interview. And that is that after the murder of Catherine Eddowes on September 30th of 1888, a message was found written on a building called the Goulston Street Graffito, and this message says something to the effect of, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The word Jews is misspelled, J-U-E-W-S, or something to that effect. We don't actually know because Sir Charles Warren ordered the Goulston Street Graffito to be erased before it could be photographed, but for all intents and purposes, there was a message that was written on the building that said something similar to that. And one thing that Tracy Ianson said was that maybe the message actually said the Levys are the men who are not to be blamed for nothing. And if you were to look at a certain type of writing script, the word Jews maybe wasn't written at all. Maybe it was actually the word Levies, referring to Jacob Levy, as well as his cousin Joseph Chaim Levy. And I mean, okay, I'm just going to stop right there so I don't get a little bit heated up. And that is that this is something that really bothered me. I'm not going to lie to you guys, that really bothered me. It would be like, that is an enormous assumption. That is a pure assumption. I know she's presenting it as a possibility, but I'm just like, where is the physical evidence to say that the Goulston Street graffito contained the word Levies? I mean, what's your point? Like, what is your point exactly? That you could write the word Levies in a certain way so it's written very sloppily and it resembles the word Jews? Well, my name is Ned. I can write my name like to make it resemble the word nil, and that's been mistaken because I've had terrible handwriting. Some people think my name is Nell, Nell. Neo is another one, much more likable than Nell, but you can alter handwriting to make it look like other letters, but why on earth would you think that? If you had a photograph of the Goulston Street graffito and you could be like, oh, well, I actually think that this is what it says because of the shapes of the letters and because of the handwriting, that would be something. But that to me was just absolutely trying to force her theory that Jacob Levy was Jack the Ripper and that he wrote the word Levies on the Goulston Street graffito. I don't think there's an ounce of evidence to support that, and I think that that is just someone who has chosen a suspect and then is reshaping not only the evidence, oh no, this is way beyond that, they're reshaping the entire narrative to make their suspect fit. And, you know, maybe Jacob Levy was Jack the Ripper, but even if he was, I don't think there's any reason to think that the Goulston Street graffito actually said the Levies are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. That's my take on the subject. If you want to challenge me on that point, put your ideas in the comment section down below. And let's just do a quick follow-up. What do you think about the Ripper hoax theory? Do you think that Harry Dam is a reasonable suspect for writing the letters? Do you think that Aaron Kosminsky is a reasonable suspect? And also, should people provide explanations about why Kosminsky was not Jack the Ripper, as stated in that video clip there, or audio clip rather? And what do you think about the message of the Goulston Street graffito? Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. I also have a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, and there is BlackBoxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram, and I use those pages to upload reels and shorts which come out every Monday through Friday, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays there is a show called True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning, available here on Black Box Online Radio. Lots of content to explore. That's all for me now, and until next time.